Harvard Divinity School.
How Social Values Inspire Climate Innovation, October 21st, 2025.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I am super duper excited about this panel conversation, and you will hear why in a few minutes. But I want to thank you for joining us today for this event, How Social Values Inspire Climate Innovation. Before we begin, I would like to extend my appreciation to those who helped plan today's panel. Thank you to our colleagues across the Office for Development and External Relations, Religion and Public Life, Communications, Operations, and Facilities for making this important conversation possible. I also want to recognize our speakers, their roles in addressing climate change challenges, and their diligent efforts to help us navigate these challenges as we set our sights on a more sustainable future for all of us. We are joined today by industry leaders for a discussion about the vital need for ethical leadership, innovation, and interdisciplinary approaches to climate-related work. You will hear more about these exceptional leaders in just a moment, but I wanted to share a brief story that helped inspire today's gathering. Last year, I had the privilege of joining Kurt Kylehacker for a visit to 12 while I was in California. Kurt is a graduate of HDS and a member of our HDS Dean's Council. And he's a general partner of a company called Elementum Ventures. At Elementum, Kirk focuses on investing in companies that make a difference in the world. That led him to 12. 12 brings together the best of industry and technology in the name of sustainability. In short, they focus on transforming, quote, CO2 from the air to become replacements for conventional petroleum-based materials and ingredients found in everyday consumer products. Things like apparel or personal care products, so electronics and furniture. They really are revolutionizing the energy sector with zero fossil fuels, zero emissions, and zero trade-offs in quality and performance. I think that's pretty extraordinary. And I look forward to hearing more about it from our panelists. In their words, quote, 12 was born from a radical question. What if we could replace fossil fuels at the molecular level without compromising performance? While Kurt and I were on site, one of the co-founders, Nicholas Flanders, gave us a tour of their facility, answering my many questions about their remarkable technology and their remarkable team. I'm thrilled to have Etosha Cave, co-founder and Chief Science Officer for 12, here to educate us about this work and the promise carbon transformation holds for the future. I was also struck by the intersections of ethics and ecology when learning about this industry breakthrough. Intersections that faculty at our school, such as Nikki, Hoskins, address in their research about climate and care for nature. Furthermore, this is one of many examples where issues facing our world intersect with values informed by religion and ethics. I'm especially grateful that our Director of Religion and Public Life, Professor Terrence Johnson, will be facilitating today's discussion. Before turning things over to Terrence, who will be offering brief introductions for each of our esteemed panelists, I'd like to say a few words about his leadership. Terrence Johnson is a graduate of HDS, who now serves as the Charles G. Adams Professor of African American Religious Studies and Director of Religion and Public Life. His scholarship weaves together African American religions, political theory, and American history to paint broad conceptual schemes for imagining religion, democracy, ethics, liberalism, justice, and freedom. He is the author of a number of books and articles, including most recently, faculty associate of the Edmund and Lily Soffer Center for Ethics here at Harvard, and an inaugural Stephen M. Poland Fellow in Constitutional Law and History at the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan law and policy institute. Before he joined HDS as an MDiv student, Terrence was a journalist with an interest in business, ethics, and religion. And so Terrence, thank you for facilitating this important conversation. And now before Terrence begins this conversation, we will see a brief video that explains the company's technology and work.
Good evening, friends. Thank you, Dean Frederick, for your leadership and for coming up with this great idea. I want to thank all the panelists for coming as well and for the guests who are here tonight. In the name of conservation, we chose not to print individual programs for tonight's event. So if you'd like to read through our bios for each of our guests, I invite you to use the QR code on the posters near the front door. So we're here tonight for a conversation about how social values inspire climate innovation, and I'm glad to be here with these amazing panelists. And in my research, I was just blown away by our first guest to my far left, Dr. Etosha Cave, who's the co-founder of 12. She's a major superstar and all over the world speaking, recognized by all the major magazines, so it's an honor to see your presence and have you with us at the Divinity School. Dr. Cave, as you all know, is the co-founder and chief science officer at 12. The carbon transformation company creating the future through electrochemistry. At 12, she supports the efforts in applying research to convert captured carbon dioxide into valuable chemicals, fuels, and products typically made from fossil fuels. Her discoveries have driven technology that can disrupt supply chains across industries, including automotive, aviation, fashion, and consumer goods. Dr. Cave has been recognized by the Smithsonian Institute, the U.S. Department of Energy, Rolling Stone, and Vanity Fair. She has spoken at the Mars Conference, Fortune Brainstorm, and Aspen Ideas Festival. In 2024, CNBC named her to its Changemakers list of women transforming business. Dr. Cave holds a master's and PhD in mechanical engineering from Stanford University. I'm also glad and honored to have my esteemed colleague, Dr. Nikki Hoskins, with us, also a proud HDS alumna. She is assistant professor of religion and ecology at the Divinity School. Her work attends to Christian histories of colonial, racial, and environmental domination. Professor Hoskins is completing a book manuscript titled Blackness Weathered, Decolonial Ethics for the Earth, where she researches the religious and ecological practices of Black women in Chicago's Outgeld Gardens, an area sociologists identify as one of the most egregious cases of environmental racism in the U.S. And last but not least, we also have our friend and alumnus as well, Kurt Kalhacker. He is a general partner at Elementum Ventures. He is a venture capitalist with over 20 years of experience in Silicon Valley and Paris. He also teaches MBA courses in AI strategy, Analytics and Entrepreneurial Finance at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and the University of San Francisco. Previously, Kurt was an executive in tech and corporate finance in the US and Europe. He earned an MBA from the University of Chicago, an MLA from Stanford, and, as you all know, MTS from Harvard Divinity School. So before we get into our conversation, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our unique as panelists. It gives us all a real great pleasure to reflect upon how HDS can play a major role in linking together technology, innovation, and religious ethics. So I'll begin our panel discussion by asking two of our panelists to tell us about their stories and about their companies first. But before we do that, we have a short video presentation about the work of Etosha's company. Sorry about that. So let's begin with the first question then. For Dr. Cave and Kirk, can you tell us about your companies, 12 and Elemental Ventures? Dr. Cave?
Yeah, absolutely. So just on the video, we do a process called industrial photosynthesis. So we take the carbon dioxide and water molecule, we put it in the presence of electricity and a metal catalyst. And what happens with that electricity, it effectively electrocutes the molecule to smaller atomic bits. And those atomic bits reform into new molecules. So in my graduate work at Stanford, we identified 16 new molecules we could make from just CO2, water, in the presence of a metal catalyst and electricity. And so, I was really passionate about this research when I was a grad student, and I wanted to take it into industry. So I started a company where we now focus on making that a reality. And I actually brought some materials we made. So this is a polyurethane foam we made from CO2 in our collaboration with Mercedes-Benz. I also have this car part that we also made with Mercedes-Benz. So this is a C-pillar. And in each one of these cases, we took the CO2 and water molecule, broke it down into new atomic bits, and reformed those bits into new molecules. And these are the same parts you would make from fossil fuels. We were able to make them from air, from CO2 and water. And so we're now scaling up that technology. We're building our first major commercial plant in Washington State. And our first flagship molecule will actually be jet fuel. So the same jet fuel that you supply commercial planes, you can drop in our jet fuel up to 50% blended with existing conventional jet fuel and use it to reduce your carbon emissions score quite drastically. So we have a partnership with Alaska Airlines, and we're excited to be selling that fuel and doing regular flights with Alaska Airlines. We're currently commissioning that plant, so we're the last 10% of getting everything going. So knock on wood, in the next few months we'll have a startup and be able to start up the plant and be able to sell that fuel to Alaska Airlines.
Kurt. I'm Kurt Kyle. It's great to be with you all. I've spent many hours as a student in this room, so I have both good and maybe medium memories of the stress of being in this room. It's great to be here. I am part of Elemental Ventures. We are a deep tech venture capital fund in Silicon Valley. And deep tech means that we actually try to seek out new technologies that are often at the intersections of several different disciplines, scientific disciplines, and engineering disciplines. And it's just our pleasure to work with founders such as Natasha and Nicholas, who are the co-founders of 12. And because we're an early stage investor, we often will be meeting the founders like them when it's just a business plan, when it's just a slide deck. There's been no technology that can be demonstrated in terms of in a lab beyond a few experiments. And we love being amongst the first capital that comes into these companies. So that's why we're considered a seed deep tech venture capital firm in Silicon Valley.
Very wonderful. Professor Hoskins, can you say more about how you see HDS playing a role in these kinds of conversations?
For sure. I mean, HDS, what makes us unique is that we engage religion and ecology from multiple religions. But what also makes us unique is that we don't sort of buy into the supposed separation between religion and science or religion and technology. We approach it very interdisciplinary, and so that means being in conversation with scientists and with engineers as well as folks from our religious traditions and the wisdom of our traditions, to think about climate innovation and climate change. But and what's important within those religious traditions, always centering those who are most vulnerable. And so as we move en route to climate innovation, and for what I see HDS doing is making sure that those who are poor and maybe those are most vulnerable, the elderly, are not being left out of the conversation in this move toward sort of rapid change to save theirs.
And Dr. King, can you say more about, how you got into this work? In our conversation, on Zoom, you mentioned this idea, rooted in community was the first thing you mentioned, and how that community was so central to your lab work at Stanford.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Houston, Texas, and when I was a teenager, it was discovered in a neighborhood adjacent to where my parents, where I grew up and my parents still are, that there was an abandoned oil and gas waste site. And that waste had leached into the water supply, and it was linked to a higher rate of rare forms of cancers and diseases. There was actually a class action lawsuit, a few years ago I looked up, there was a master's student that wrote a paper about it, because the EPA was involved, and it was kind of a big deal on the national scale. And even though my family wasn't directly involved, we were a bit upstream of where that had happened, but my friends and neighbors and so forth were all wrapped up into this ultimately class action lawsuit. And it had a huge impact on me because I asked the question why do we have to have this waste impact humans in this way? Why do we live in a world where, this human impact is very, and what can I do to do something about it? So I was very drawn to math and science as a young student, and so I continued on that path, and I was always looking for a way, how can we get the energy that we still use and love, let's build our civilization. And in the case of Houston, Houston's an energy city, so you get indoctrinated pretty early about how important energy is in creating civilization in modern society. And so I still wanted us to have that energy that we use and love, but let's do it in a cleaner way. So when I got to grad school, finding my professor in the chemical engineering department was really this aha moment of, okay, here's something where I can make an impact and do the science and math that I love, also make an impact on communities that have to deal with waste and do this waste that we currently throw into the air, reuse it and use it in a way that to me was very elegant, and it still meant that we could grow our societies and maintain modern society. And I think it also harkens to, we talked about natural capitalism a little bit, and that was one thing I studied as an undergrad, and it to me this analogy with the trees that we use for our technology is very apropos. And when you think about a tree and the fruit that it bears, trees don't make a calculation and only do the as many seeds as it possibly needs. It makes as many as it possibly can, but those seeds and those apples and that fruit, they become a feedstock for another process. They're food for humans and animals, and they get planted and actually become another tree. And so I was asking the question, can we not do that in an industrial context? Can we not have waste from one industrial source become a feedstock for another? And so this process is one of many that answers that question.
Well, thank you. And Kurt, I'm curious, can you say more about how did you get into this work? Because often, think about religion and money, it's a huge battle, huge fight, and you were actually doing this work while you were a graduate student at the Divinity School. So I'm curious, why and how did you come to terms with what some people see as contradictions, but you found a way to make this blend?
Great question. Working in venture capital and private equity, we were really good at measuring everything but meaning. And that's one of the things that actually was helpfully inserted into me and amplified at HDS, was in terms of asking the more normative questions of the way that things should be, not just accepting the way that things are. And while I would like to say that, when I was in my 20s, I was so conscious enough to think about the intentionality of going into finance and to venture capital to be able to have that kind of agency. I think it checked the boxes of wanting to make a difference in the world with particular tools that I had and being able to add something more to that. And of course, in Silicon Valley, and there's many good examples of great technologists and great social progress, and there are many poor examples of the misuse of these technologies and their ambition in changing the world into not so positive places.
And did you ever find moments where you were actually thinking, well, maybe the system needs to implode, or were you really frustrated at moments?
Well, I'm a fan of elements of creative destruction. And so there are elements of sometimes when you see parts of our economy, of our systems, that is, that should get burned. That should get torched in some ways. I've been more recently doing a lot more work in mainland China, and there are a lot of things that I find very attractive in terms of how they've been able to kind of create some social compacts within China. And connection. And there's a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance there that I would want to unpack. But there are a lot of things that we can learn from other countries and other societies to up our game.
Well, thank you, Professor Hoskins. Can you say more about your work in terms of thinking about decolonization, thinking about race, and how you're bringing in really many different disciplines as you're approaching climate sustainability? Can you just say very briefly, how are you teaching students asking really hard questions that are normative, but also allowing for dissent?
Yeah, well, I teach students, we have to first understand the problem of what's happening. I think we often want to rush to removing the problem, which gets us to the innovation of the thing, but staying with the problem before we make the diagnoses. And what I've learned is that we often have some kind of historical amnesia, that colonialization, enslavement, these processes have created the state that we're actually in. So then what does it mean then to think about the problem and our solutions with that in mind? And so it's really about kind of bringing these various disciplines. So then if solutions are based in science and technology, how do we also get science and technology to think decolonially or to respond in ways so that we're not going back to past histories and repeat it all over again? So for me, it's about asking those hard questions and getting students to think differently, think otherwise. I really don't want them to repeat what's happened, what has got us here in the first place. And part of that is just like knowing what got us here in the first place so that we can actually start to diagnose the problem and then imagine a more just future. So that imagination piece, I often find is last. We spend a lot of time on like what's happening in the world. And then what are some of our religious traditions saying about it?
Oh, that's beautifully said, thank you. And Dr. K, can you say more about, because you actually lived this out. You didn't have amnesia, right? You came to Stanford with a set of questions, and yet it seems like you allow sort of the lab and process to drive your work. So can you walk us through what exactly you're doing in the lab and how you're trying to transform carbon dioxide into these sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what happens in the lab is, very much like setting up reactors and, doing, like, testing different recipes and always kind of asking, okay, like, how can we make this better? Like measuring, like, what the metrics are to improve the technology. So, well, some of the day-to-day things are very much deep in this, like, optimization. And it's really lovely, like, being on panels like this, take a moment, step back, and kind of, like, look at the big picture and see how that all fits in. And because sometimes you can have, like, very mild view of, like, let's get to the next metric. I love to, our mission in general attracts talent. Our mission in general is what we get up every morning for, even though we don't consciously think about that. And serving these communities with the alternative to have the jet fuel, have the flight that we still want to take but do it in a cleaner way, like have materials that bring comfort and materials in this room, but let's do it in a cleaner way. So that's kind of our North Star.
And I know you get this question all the time, but as I was thinking about this conversation, I'm like, well, why not electric planes? It seems like that should be the future. Can you say more why that's physically why that's not possible for the current moment?
Yeah, well, I can tell you a story about that. So when I was a grad student, NASA had this challenge, and you got $1 million if you solve this challenge. And the challenge was simple. It's just increase the energy density of batteries by 2x. So from the state of the art, just go to 2x. Clearly NASA wants us to use our batteries in space and so forth. So me and my group of graduate students, we were in an electrochemistry lab. We're like, we can build a battery, 2x energy density, of course. So we went from first principles. We sat down with a periodic table and we said, okay, to make a battery, you need an oxidation reaction, you need a reduction reaction. Basically, these molecules are basically transferring electrons. So we just did the atomic mass of, column A, column B, and sum all that up and saw like what weight that would have, and then calculate the energy that you produce from that battery and get energy density. And so we literally did the entire periodic table, and we came up with about like 4 or 5 molecule pairs where, not including all the packaging and everything, just the molecules that transfer the electrons themselves would meet this 2x requirement. And the thing about those 4 or 5 pairs is that they have some of the most corrosive things. Like one is like this hydrofluoric acid where it's like if it gets on your skin, it doesn't burn you strongly, but it eats your bones. And so we're not making that battery. And hydrogen itself is very difficult to work with. So at the end of the day, we were like, okay, we're not going to even, we can't even do this. This is an impossible challenge. And I think it just speaks to why we don't fly with planes, because the amount of energy you can get in a containment to be able to fly, use lift to go and fly a 200 passenger plane, it's just not going to happen from the laws of physics as we know them. Now, if someone comes up with new laws of physics, that's a whole different thing. But the laws of physics that we know now, it's you can't get the energy in there. And you can for 2-person short haul flights. There's you can even have hydrogen gas as like a fuel cell that can provide an alternative. But if we're going to do 200 passenger long haul flights, intercontinental, flights that get us to other parts of the country, other parts of the world, that connects us all. I mean, we all are here in person. We could have done this over Zoom technically, but there's something about being in person and using that energy to get us in person. I think is still valuable. It's something we still want for our kids and our grandkids. And so, we said why don't we make the fuel that can get us there and make it cleaner?
Thank you. And Kurt, I'm curious in terms of, you talk a lot about, HDS and so the great courses you took here and the values. Do the values have to always align with the profit? In other words, why this particular company?
Yeah, well, I think it's first of all, in terms of coming alongside of some terrific founders that have a unique insight in something that will change a market or change an approach to something. And for us, we have the luxury of being able to decide what are the technologies we want to double down on. And we have, for the most part, chosen to kind of do some more difficult things, not necessarily easy ones. Now, clearly, we're profit motivated. We want to have great returns, but we also realize that those are probably going to be longer tail. So meaning that you could be invested in a company for 10, 15 years, whereas in terms of the classic venture capital model in a perfect world, you would like to see some exit opportunities in 5 to 7 years. If you're private equity, you basically have a 5-year clock in many ways. So we intentionally choose some of these technologies that have longer tails, and we do them because we think that it's a way in which that we can not only make a difference in the world, but also that we can make a fair return for our investors.
And what specifically stood out about this company?
Well, it's and again, it's an early stage guy. I'm like when you meet the founders, they're just amazing. I mean, they're just absolutely amazing people. And so when we find amazing founders that are doing things that sound like science fiction, we're there. That's what we want to do.
And how long is this commitment? How does it work? Do you invest for a certain period of time, and then at what point do you say we need to pull out?
Yeah, well, so that's one of the differences between venture capital and private equity, is that we're there for the long term. So we don't get paid until there is an exit opportunity. Whereas in terms of oftentimes in private equity or in banking in general, it will be much more longer term, where they need to get a liquidity at a certain point in time. You're also seeing the venture capital industry change. Andreessen Horowitz is a perfect example. It's one of the largest, most well-known venture funds, where they're talking now about permanent capital. And so one of the things that I'm actually thinking more about, both in terms of business models and in terms of my teaching, is what does it look like to actually invest permanent capital? How does that change the calculus as you as a decision maker, and as how you interact with the founders and creators of these companies?
This is a question open to the entire panel. How do we deal with this conversation, also deal with climate change in the context in which people are raising questions about the fundamental veracity of it, in terms of federal government, in terms of all kinds of fringe groups? What's the response as people who are scholars and who are scientists? Do you just ignore the noise, or is there a way of real deep engagement?
Yeah, I like to think about it in multiple ways. I mean, one way to talk about climate is really just like, what future do we want to leave for our kids and grandkids? And in fact, this past summer, I went on a pilgrimage to Paris, France. The Beyonce concert ticket After the concert, I then went on a ghost tour, and we went to Notre Dame. And there's two ghost stories in Notre Dame. The first one is this woman who fell off the thing, and she's ghost now. And then the other one is this architect. And the tour was saying, Korea was saying, it took 200 years to build Notre Dame, and they had 5 architects, and the 5th architect designed the doors. There's a whole ghost story around it, and I won't go into details, but I was thinking, wait, what, 200 years? 4 or 5 architects? If you think about it, if you were the first architects or the first set of engineers, or the first set of bricklayers, you were building something that you knew you would never see it finished. Not you, your kids, your grandkids, you're building something for future generations to enjoy, which now I, as one of those future generations, get to enjoy. That's kind of how I look at solving these really big planetary problems. In some ways, we're doing it for ourselves. I mean, we can build computers much quicker now. It takes maybe 5 to 10 years, not 200 years, and so we can tackle this problem much quicker. But we're really doing it for the future. We want our kids, I think we all want our kids and grandkids to be in a world in which they can say, wow, look at what past generations left for us to enjoy, the beauty we now get to experience with others. And so, I think grabbing into that more optimistic vision of the future, and and again, when you're doing technology, you are still creating jobs, you have to create economic value, and you kind of think of more of an abundance mindset as opposed to let's stop. I think that's probably one of the things that got a little bit of division is when you talk about climate change, stop doing this and stop doing that and change your habits. And I personally think that we can redesign how we interact in the world and have technology, waste from one cycle becomes the feedstock for the other, and that's the way we can still kind of coexist in this world and have industry that each.
And I mean, perfect. I think that is piggyback on that and to say, regardless of climate deniers, we feel it happening even within Boston, and we see it happening in the news. What's happening in Texas with the floodings, and so it's. I think for me, I'm always impressing on people just to open their eyes and see that, winters have been warmer, or that children actually dying from these floods because we don't have weather systems to support them and to alert us. So I think that for me, I'm always wanting to link toward the violence of denying that climate is changing. What does that do to folks who don't have certain protections? And I agree. I think regardless of whether or not we think climate is changing, we have some ethical responsibility to the earth, right? There's stewardship, there's tradition that teaches us stewardship. And so if we are in alignment with those, that in itself should teach us how to behave and to act toward the earth and to our creature others. And so I think that it's not just noise, climate deniers. I think about it in terms of trying to think about it in terms of power and politics, but also trying to put it in its place and talk about real lives are being changed and shifted because of climate change. So I try to put it in perspective there. And so I think that's really my point. And it's kind of a harsh, hard look I don't think about climate change outside of violence. I don't think about environmental racism and justice outside of violence. And that's a really big key thing for me. And that's not to say that there's not hope. My hope is that we rethink violence to each other and to the earth, actually. And that's the kind of hope that I get out of working with students and working with the people who I work with in Chicago.
Do you see a tension in terms of this philosophy of abundance and potentially the need to pull back and kind of reduce our waste? How do you deal with that tension?
The tension of more like abundance and
the potential need to maybe slow things down in terms of our footprint.
For sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think the earth is abundant. I'm not someone who thinks that it's all going up in flames. I think I'm really wary of crisis language. To think about what that language is serving, who is it serving. There are many communities who've been in crisis over and over again. Even language around Anthropocene. The indigenous community has experienced many, many Anthropocenes, if we really put it in that perspective. And so, I think there's some balance needs to be, we have to strike a balance with it all. And certainly, care for the earth and the abundance it is providing and care for it in ways that are sustainable. And always reduce waste in ways that we can do personally, but also these things are part of systems. And I don't ever want to put the responsibility back on individual people to reduce and change climate change altogether, reduce waste. There are systems in place that perpetuate these things, and we have to actually attack the systems, at least in my understanding and the way that I teach it.
Kurt, I'm curious, can you say more in terms of what are you hoping that you're sort of creating here in terms of your work that you want folks in the Divinity School, and speak to our students now, to grasp from what you're doing? And yeah.
Well, I really like the word that she used, stewardship. I think that we need to have a bigger imagination in terms of what does it mean to be a steward today with the resources that are there. And we can make one or two mistakes. We can, on the one hand, deny that there's anything to be stewarded, or we can believe that it can be easily solved and with just an abundance mindset, or something that we can conveniently throw and not actually deal with some of the incredibly important, significant historical dimensions that how we arrived at where we are today. But stewardship starts in awe, not in control. And I think that that's a helpful position to start off from. That has hope, but it also has agency. And I think that that's something that for all of us as practitioners and being here, preparing the next generation, is that we need to be able to give that hope and that encouragement for agency.
Sure. And do you talk about hope at work, and how do you translate that to all these business people?
Well, that's what's awesome about dealing with entrepreneurs. I mean, we have to have hope, and so often we don't. If you knew, in terms of, when I think about co-op, which is very classic for any deep tech company, the challenges that they have to deal with every few months. I mean, most mortals would die after 2 or 6 months. I mean, the fortitude that they have to have. It's not me. I mean, it's them that live this out. And it takes a lot of bravery, it takes a lot of steadfastness, but it takes the confidence that they can add something and be a good steward of the opportunity to make something better and hopefully make the world a better place.
Sure. So, Dr. K, can you say more about some of these challenges? I think I didn't know about this. Can you say more about what Kurt is referring to?
Oh yeah, I sometimes call it like, you have to produce several miracles around. Yeah, well, first I want to say, I think Kurt's giving us a lot of praise and appreciate it, but I think Kurt's one of our early investors, their team has been so amazing. They really are very founder focused, which, being in Silicon Valley, you hear a lot of stories of VC firms that are not as founder focused, and it's really been great to be part of our family. And certainly, this is certainly a great example of how they're thinking much broadly and have that same passion for deep tech the way that we do. So it's been really lovely working with them. And you know, I think there's in every aspect, every dimension, like starting a company is just a it's just like strategic thing that you're always navigating. You know, there's the external market forces. You know, when we first got started, we were 100% funded by grants. National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, NASA. You know, now, like, in fact, I've taken a bit of a sabbatical and I'm mentoring. I'm still with 12 part-time, but I'm part-time also mentoring the next generation of scientists and engineers whose nonprofit called Activate. By the way, applications are open, so if anyone's doing a tech company, let me know. Apply. But as I'm mentoring these early stage startups, and they don't have the National Science Foundation funding. The Department of Energy is not giving out any money. It's unclear what's happening. And you know, and NASA is also unclear. So it's just like, you know, there's this new marketplace where they are interacting with, and I'm having to, you know, have those same conversations with them. Like, okay, well, let's talk about some other avenues you can go through. And you're always kind of pivoting and looking over the horizon. So, it's, you know, it is like this beautiful creation of people coming together, work toward a mission, but it's also like there's a lot of stormy seas out there and you're out in the ocean and getting to the next milestone.
And you guys have any questions of each other you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I was wondering, I think both of y'all have mentioned ethics in one way or another. I think Etosha, where you were talking about the NASA challenge and about how you were looking at the periodic table and you were going through different things and you have in mind of discernment, like, oh, we don't want to use that element. So how, in your work, do you, is there like an ethical process you go through for like how you look to decide the kind of impact that you want to make or communities you want to serve? I think, you know, I'm thinking about ethical deliberation as we make technologies. Of course, even the good ones that are like, you know, changing how we, not using fossil fuels anymore, but how do you, do you have this process for ethical discernment? And then for you too, Kirk, is there kind of any process for ethical discernment as you're thinking about what companies to invest in and those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that ethics for me doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, it's always about talking with other people and getting different viewpoints. You know, as a grad student, I was in a graduate lab, and we would always, you know, occasionally talk about these things over a beer or wine or something. And you know, because any technology can be used for ill reasons. And so, you know, like thinking through some of the nuances and complexities and like, what does it mean? How do you put in some guardrails? Because I do ultimately think as humans, we are built, we're wired to, you know, use technology and you know, make the world around us a better place. You know, just thinking about like being in this building and all the things, ways in which we have modern society. We've lifted billions of people out of poverty. Billions of people exist because of technology. Like we don't have enough natural nitrogen products to support 8 billion people, but we were able to do the Haber-Bosch process that makes nitrogen, you know, ammonia basically from air. And so, you know, so there's a lot of amazing things that technology has done. There's some ways in which technology is not been great. And so, you know, talking about these things has really been helpful. And again, like panels like this has been great to like take a moment to step back and look at what one's doing. And I would say even specifically in the company, we had a moment where we were applying for a Department of Defense grant. So we did apply for it, we did get it. So one of our first contracts was with making fuel for the Air Force. And this was during the Biden administration, so it was very clear that it was for low carbon use fuel, and there are folks in the military who care about that. You know, now we talk about domestic production of fuel, but it's the same fuel, but it's just a different way we talk about it. But we definitely had employees that would come up to us all the time and say like, hey, you know, we thought about what it means to be working with the Department of Defense. And so we had these like really deep conversations. And I remember one time what really got tricky was that we were talking with one of our employees who was a veteran. So he was in the Navy, he worked in submarines. And you know, for him to talk about, and to be in front of him and talk about, oh, well, we we can't, we're not going to engage with this entity that you served in, that you felt you had this mission with. It just was kind of, it made ethics very real, and it made it a very different conversation, I thought, than this kind of more cerebral one where people who had not served in the military not have to go defend for reasons that they presumably thought were righteous at the time and defend this country. And so, it's still kind of a line in which that should be discussed many times about how are we supporting or not supporting different missions. So, it's still a question that comes up.
In answer to your question, Nikki, I think that for us, we've seen enough in terms of in the entrepreneurs that we invest in that we really want to double down on who the founders are and less on the first idea that they have, because oftentimes they will pivot into a second or third idea or incarnation of that. And it's kind of like if you invest in the right people, they're going to be having an approach that's going to allow them to make good decisions along the way that will optimize the opportunity. And so if they have again, Etosha is a perfect textbook example of the kind of skill sets that she and the rest of her team have in terms of discovery and of invention. There's many different ways that they can apply those learnings and those capabilities. But when you meet them, that they will find the best usage of their observations in the market that's there. And the beautiful thing about the market is if you combine those elements together, people that are ethically grounded, a market that has opportunities and being able to address new technologies and new products or services, that is the holy grail. And so that's kind of how we think about it.
I'm curious, can you address this issue around access? Because I know I've watched a number of interviews with Dr. King, and people make a big deal, oh, this woman doing these weird things, and to make that acknowledgement is an indication that clearly there's a historical kind of issue of access. And how are you negotiating that given the history of where we are now? How do we name it? How do we ensure that there are more Dr. Kings?
Well, first of all, we do it very poorly. And I think that we are continuing to learn along the ways how to do that better. And there's nothing better than in terms of investing early on early examples of people who can embody the best that they can be in an incredible market. And there is a market discipline here in terms of where there is. You look at a team of at 12. These are world-class people in every category. And in terms of, you need to make sure that you are reaching out and trying to identify people perhaps earlier in their career than you normally might. Perhaps you're looking at different areas than you normally might. But there's still the natural pattern recognition that we have as VCs in terms of that. Anybody gets extra points if they're coming from a place like Harvard or Stanford. There are things that are embedded in those experiences that gives an investor confidence that they have a higher probability of being able to attract like-minded, like-talented individuals. And again, there's a lot of imperfection in that, but it is something that is done, first of all, imperfectly, but it can be done intentionally and with a humility that says that we need to learn how to continue to get better at this.
And would you attribute part of that thinking based on your experience with HDS?
Yeah, I would. I was also, I did my undergraduate at a college called Wheaton College, and I think it was embedded in me from the very beginning of that. I wanted to make the world a better place, and I wanted to be a good steward of the opportunities that the Creator gave us. And so that was embedded there as well, and I think it was turbocharged here.
And Nikki, I'm going to just kind of expand this a bit in terms of innovation. Often, our students hear the word innovation and think of something new. And again, take out historical context. Can you talk about innovation in terms of your work and really complexify that category and historically what it means for you as a thinker and how you talk about it in the classrooms?
Yeah, I often deter students from going to innovation first because they want to go there before understanding the context. But once we're past that, I really do look at the way in which community members who are under duress are already being innovative in ways that are not getting any sort of light shown on them. I think about the women who I study in this community called Ogilvy Garden. It's it's called a sort of the toxic dump, or basically polluting industry circle the community on all sides. And before this Black housing project was built there, it was a industrial sewage site. And so when the city sold the industrial sewage, instead of them getting rid of the sewage, it just kind of pounded it into the soil and built this Black housing complex on top of it. So this Black community was literally thrown in the trash. And just after a year or so of being there, residents started having like skin rashes, rare forms of cancer started appearing, kids being born with all kinds of birth defects, and kids with asthma and breathing issues. And I watched the women in that community galvanize, and they did what I would call a kind of citizen science, sociologists. They went door to door and literally surveyed their entire community. And I'm talking about women who don't have anything past an elementary school education, but understood what was happening was not supposed to be happening in their community. And then they go to the library and they research what the land was. And so all of these things, started coming together. And this was a sort of what I would call kind of citizen innovation. And then they started making different technologies and things to track, trucks coming in and out of the communities and dumping on them, to track the weather. And so this is all just kind of grassroots of just folks, everyday folks in a housing project in Chicago coming together to figure this out. And so I really try to think about innovation from the bottom up sometimes, because I think that's one of the key ways in which we often miss what's important. And sometimes we miss the problem too if we don't go from the bottom up. So innovation is important, but it's not value neutral. It's not something that is just a neutral category. So I really try to help students understand how to complexify that.
Sponsored by Religion and Public Life and Development and External Relations at Harvard Divinity School.
Copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.